He's the night news editor. He's got well over 20 years experience in national newspaper journalism, primarily in news, seen huge variety of changes and still the changes that are carrying on in the news industry. So for all of those of you doing news, extremely relevant. But he's also a very keen sports journalist. So for those of you interested in sports and sports journalism, he will have a lot to share with us. So I'd like you to introduce you to Roy Hayes.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you for inviting me along today, and thank you to everyone for turning up. It's daunting to see so many people here. Wasn't quite expecting so many people, but yeah, thanks for coming along. And it's very encouraging as well to see so many would-be journalists. I think you probably are aware by now that the industry, the media industry in general, is facing a lot of challenges. It's a very, very uncertain future. And I think there's two huge challenges, or some people might call them threats. And that's basically ethical. How do journalists go about their job? And there's plenty of criticism about the way journalists do that. But also financial as well, because the traditional model that I'm being used to, newspapers, it's gravitating more towards online. Magazines are facing the same challenge, books as well. So it's basically how we go forward and deal with those two challenges. Now, journalists have, since the printing presses were first invented, journalists have had a bad rap. I think we rank alongside estate agents and grave diggers in terms of public perception. Not exactly everybody's most desirable job description, but yeah, people are still drawn to the profession. And for those who do go into journalism, I think the majority find it rewarding. But nevertheless, with all these challenges and all of these bad descriptions of journalists, and most recently fake news seems to be the phrase in the moment. A lot of people will say, why on earth would you want to become a journalist? It's you want your head testing really. But hopefully, in the course of the next few minutes, half an hour, I'll be able to convince you that it's still a profession worth going into. So, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, it's going through convulsions and change, unprecedented change really. And I think just to quantify it, if you bear with me, I'll just give you a very quick run through of my backstory, my career, and hopefully that will give you some indication just of the extensive change that's already happened and of the change that is still happening. So I think Sharon said I've been around the block a bit. I've been at the Telegraph 27 years. I've actually been a journalist for exactly 40 years. Some people might call me a veteran, other people might call me a dinosaur or a fossil. If the cap fits, I'll wear it. I'm happy with any of those descriptions. But the thing that drove me into working in newspapers, I used to be a newspaper boy. I don't know whether such things even exist anymore, but you used to go out and deliver newspapers through people's letterboxes. And while I was waiting for the bundle to be prepared, I'd have every single national newspaper laid out in front of me in big piles. And while I was waiting for the bag to be ready, I'd read maybe the back pages to see how my football team had done. And I was fascinated that 6, 7, 8 different publications could have the same story, but present it in different ways, use different pictures, different headlines, different interpretation of what happened in the 90 minutes the previous night. And that piqued my interest. And plus I was mad about football, and I thought, wow, what a great way to earn a living. But it was only when I was 18 I got the chance to turn that ambition into reality. And I didn't go to university. I joined straight from school, and it's which wasn't so unusual in those days. It's pretty rare now. But I went to work for a publication called the Birkenhead News. That's my local newspaper based on Merseyside. Came out twice a week, which was quite an odyssey really. You were either a weekly or an evening paper. This was somewhere in between. But most large towns had a weekly newspaper. Many had an evening newspaper. Some would have 2 evening newspapers. London used to have 3. That's how newspapers dominated the landscape in those days. I was hired as a general reporter, so my initial training on the Birkenhead News was you'd go out and you'd cover the magistrates' court, you go to council meetings. Every day before I went into the office, I called in at the local police station and the fire station and spoke to the people who worked there. And you were able to build up a relationship and build up contacts. It was an excellent grounding, but it was a time when newspapers had the resources to do that. It's not so much the case nowadays, unfortunately. But anyway, armed with just 100 words a minute shorthand, a notebook, a pen, and enough loose change to put into the local public telephone box, they were all the kit I needed, all the technology I needed. If I was going to send over copy, very often I would dictate it down the telephone to a copy taker. That's how we used to get the copy across. Now that was the outside of the office. Sometimes when I'd come in, I would type up my copy on a typewriter, and then we used a process. Has anyone heard of the process called hot metal? It was a way that newspapers used to be produced. That basically, reporter would type out their copy on pieces of paper. It was then taken downstairs. A linotype operator would then type out exactly the same words, and they'd be formed into metal characters, hence hot metal, put into a frame. A cast was made, and then that was sent off to the press site. Now, when you think of the processes involved in that and how time-consuming it was amazing, really, that newspapers ever got published. But that was not just weekly papers, that was evening papers, daily national papers as well, used the same process. And it was a process that had been around, really, for about 200 years. It's incredible. It's sort of glacial sort of change in newspapers in terms of the technology. From there, I then graduated into sport full-time, where I've been ever since. And my first kind of real, I'd say, stab at being a sports journalist, I worked on the Liverpool Daily Post. And this was in the mid-80s, when Liverpool, the city of Liverpool, had 2 football teams that used to win things. And that's changed, unfortunately. But I was lucky, though. I got to cover both Liverpool and Everton. I got to travel around Europe, and I think the highlights of my career as a football reporter was when my beloved Everton won a European trophy, and I travelled back with the team on the plane, and one of the players, Andy Gray, has anyone ever heard of Andy Gray? He became a pundit on Sky TV, and he brought the trophy round, and we all got to sip champagne out of the trophy. So I'm, 30,000 feet in the air, in a plane, travelling back from Rotterdam to Liverpool. And I had to say, I said to myself, it doesn't get much better than this. That was living the dream for me, and it was a night I didn't want to end. But anyway, the thing about working as a journalist then was once you did your story and you dictated your copy, very often you had time to think and breathe. You'd sometimes be sent off to another assignment, but generally you had a bit more time. It's fundamentally changed, which we'll come on to in a moment. Sometimes very hard to keep track of reporters as well, but quite often you'd be on a train underground and there'd be a problem. But even you're out on a bus, you're miles away from a telephone box, and it wasn't uncommon for reporters to kind of go missing for a couple of hours. And as a news editor, it would make you tear your hair out in frustration. Just a very quick example of that. Again, have you heard of the Heysel Stadium disaster? That involved Liverpool Football Club, and that was in about 1985. And it was when 39 football fans died, and there was crowd trouble, rioting inside the ground. We had 2 reporters at that game. The main football reporter was in the press box, had access to a phone, we were able to keep in touch with him. The other reporter, we said to him, go outside, see what's happening, what is this crowd trouble? Now this is in the days before mobile telephones. So he went off doing his job as you'd expect him to do, but the police mistook him for a football supporter, penned him into a corner. he was stuck there for the best part of an hour and a half, pleading with these Belgian policemen to be let out so that he could file some copy back to the desk. Even when he got out of this area, he then had to walk for several blocks to find a bar and a telephone from which he could send his copy. So the technology just wasn't very friendly for journalists then. You know, as I say, no mobile phones or laptops. So it'd be quite restricting, really, in the way you'd operate. Anyway, I went on to work in Manchester, then went over to work in Hong Kong, and the technology was again was still pretty much unchanged until from about, I'd say, the early 90s. It suddenly started to move forward. We started using desktop computers, mobile telephones, which was a huge change, and then the internet. Now, I can remember the day when we had the very first computer came into the office that had access, that was linked up to the World Wide Web. And a bit like wide-eyed children, we started playing with it. You know, you do your usual thing, you search your favourite bands or football teams or actors or whatever. And it seemed like a very entertaining toy. Some of us thought, oh, this will be a very good resource for information. I don't think a single one of us had a clue just how potentially toxic in some ways that this might be. It was basically going to mean a lot of us were going to lose our jobs. And as I say, we were caught unawares, but we weren't the only ones. As I say, this applies to other industries as well. And there was more change probably in a 10-year period, I'd say, than in the previous 100 years. So what's been the change since then and lately in newspapers? I spoke to Chris Evans, who's the editor of the Daily Telegraph, and I asked him for his view. He's the man who calls all the shots at the Telegraph. And just very quickly, his view is this. He says, the challenge is to understand what's changing and what's not. Some things are changing completely, other things aren't changing at all. What's changing are the ways journalism, the main change is the way journalism is served on websites, apps, emails and so on. And the tone of journalism is changing as well. It's more conversational, it's more visual. Pictures, videos are now often telling the story rather than just being a mere illustration. But the basics, the fundamental basics of journalism aren't changing. So a good story is still a good story. An exclusive should still pack a punch, and the best journalists are those who have the most energy and the best contacts. And a good turn of phrase remains the best way to make a story memorable. He then goes on to say, fresh thinking is the best way to create a following of people, and accuracy is more important than ever because of our dear old friend fake news and accusations that journalists are dishonourable. There are some important new skills that you can acquire, such as coding or working, say, with video and audio. But basically, the fundamentals of knowing what a good story is and being able to tell it are what are key. And he has a very upbeat message, Chris Evans. He says that journalism, in his view, is not dying, it's just changing. And I would completely concur with that. So for me, one of the biggest changes is the news cycle. We're almost at a point now, certainly on the Telegraph, of being a 24-hour operation. When I first joined, we used to have 2 editorial conferences a day. One was sort of mid-morning, the other one mid-afternoon. Heads of department would bowl up to this conference and give a verbal account of what was on their list of stories. And most of the staff would work afternoons and evenings. There were a few daytime staff who would commission copy, but basically it was an afternoon, evening, nighttime operation. Since the advent of online, that's changed completely. So you can go into the Telegraph now and virtually, apart from a couple of hours early morning, you'll see people working away inside the editorial floor. We moved through, when I first joined the company 27 years ago, we were based in the Isle of Dogs. 10 years ago we moved to Victoria, and that was a massive change for the Telegraph. We created this huge open plan editorial space, and it was basically what was torn down before was every department having its own room. The sports desk used to be great. We'd have like 4 great big televisions. You could turn the volume up, watch the matches, all that kind of stuff. That went. It became, as I say, this great big open plan. We'd have studios around the edge of the news floor as well for video and for audio editing as well, and for filming. But essentially, the company wanted to get a new way of thinking, which was online would be first, because that's quite reasonably where they saw that the future would be going. So if I can just bring it up to the present day, I'll give you just a description of what the average day is like, certainly in the sports department. I hope you bear with me doing it that way. That's obviously the area I know best. But normally we have staff coming in at 6 o'clock in the morning. And if you were to join the Telegraph and be working on a desk, it's quite likely that might be one of the first ways that you'd be asked to work. And straight away you have to hit the ground running. You might be able to get yourself a quick cup of coffee, but then you're looking at the morning papers, looking for leads, stories which perhaps you think are worth following up or giving a new approach. And that then entails setting up galleries or features, or you might want to do something online. Harry Kane's 10 top goals of the season, so you'll source the pictures and you'll write copy for that as well. 7 o'clock, the online editor comes in, and his job then is to basically just make sure that the things that are already put in process are the right ones. He also fills in what's called an online grid, and this is an intra-departmental facility where every department logs the stories. We have to put on what the subject matter is of the story, who the person is who is going to be writing the story, the person who's commissioned it, and then once the copy is filed and processed, initially for online, you give it a URL, so that's one way of tracking the copy down quickly. You're probably aware of this already, but the peak times for online engagement now is around about 8:30 to 10 o'clock. It's when people are getting ready for work, making their way to work, and they do their first bit of checking of emails and also just catching up with the news. And then there's another spike around about lunchtime, when people again have more downtime. So to kind of get ahead of that, we have the first conference of the day, which is at 8 o'clock, and that is all the heads of the departments go along to that conference. And that includes the head of sport, the early news editor on sport will attend as well as the other heads of department. And basically they're just mapping out what the likely big stories of the day are going to be, but also what's already working well online. And we have a measuring facility called Parsley. Don't ask me what that stands for, but it's an odd name, but it gives you a very clear indication of the stories that are already doing well for online, which should be encouraged. At noon we have a further conference, and this time this is more geared towards the needs of the newspaper, and the picture editor by that time as well will have a good selection of images, which he will flag up on a screen, which you get to see. So it's not just left to the guesswork of some thicko like me on the sports desk thinking what might be the best image sports-wise. We have professional eyes on it, and they will suggest certain images that we should use. And in politics as well, by that time as well, most political stories have been trailed or flagged up. So from the news side, they have a pretty good idea of the main political stories. And then at 4 o'clock, you have another conference. And this really is more of a newspaper geared conference, and certainly by that time, most big stories of the day would have happened or have been flagged up. Now, the one thing that you can't predict at the conferences, of course, are breaking stories, and as the phrase suggests, these can normally come at you most unexpectedly, and you basically in the old days you might have time to think about how you approach these stories, but because of the needs of online now, it needs an instant response. You just cannot put it off. You really have to be quick out of the blocks. Let me give you an example. If, say, Jose Mourinho were to resign unexpectedly at Manchester United, first thing you do is you get a tweet out to say Jose Mourinho's. It looks good if, as a news organisation, you can get that news out there. Now, at the Telegraph, we don't like to tweet just into thin air. We like to link it to a story. So while you're getting the tweet ready, one person on the desk, usually one of the online staff, is preparing the tweet. Another person is very quickly bashing out 200 words just to, off the top of their head, on the little information they've got, to announce to the world that this story has happened. Meantime, the news editor, which is my job, then has to scramble the reporters or the writers to respond to it. Now, on a big story like that, the amount of accompanying content you need. You'd want to do a timeline of his career at Manchester United or as a manager. You'd also want to do a list of the likely replacements as manager at Manchester United. You'd want some video as well, some of Jose's biggest rants after football matches. You also want probably your chief sports writer to do an overview piece and an assessment. You want your news writer, first of all, to service online, so he has to do say a 300, 400 word story that's a bit more polished and a bit more informed than what the guy on the desk has done. But he then has to, as soon as he's done that, he then has to dig into the story and find out why has Jose Mourinho resigned. Is it because he's not getting enough money to spend? Has he fallen out with a kit man? Does he just hate the Manchester rain? There could be all kinds of reasons. So you still got to allow the reporter to prosecute the story and to dig down. But once he's done that, he will send over an updated version for the internet. News will probably want something on it as well. So the same reporter, having already done an instant hit for online, done a considered piece for online, will now have to do a write-off for the news pages, and then he'll be expected probably to do more content, which is his own assessment of the manager's career at the club, and then he'll do a further news report for the newspaper the next day, because there will be reaction and there'll be quotes and maybe further information. So in an ideal world, a story like that, if it breaks at noon, perfect. You've got not all the time in the world, but you've got enough time and enough resources and enough people around to be able to marshal all of that and attack it properly. But even that early, you can see the guy on the spot who generally covers Manchester United, is going to be producing copy in quite a few different ways. He'll also be tweeting throughout the day as well, any updated information he's got, and as well as other people on the writing team. So it's great if it happens early in the day. If it happens late at night, 10 o'clock, when you've got, say, a busy night of live sport or live football, absolute nightmare. And believe me, I've been in that position more times than I've had hot dinners. And I think particularly coming, as I do, from a newspaper background, I'm sure you guys grasp it. So a lot of people don't. They think, oh, big story happens at 10 o'clock, you just respond in the way that I have. But one of the particular problems for a newspaper production team is you've then got to decide what you're going to chuck out of what was originally going to be in the pages to accommodate this new copy. So very often you're crunching, 3 or 4 pages worth of content down into just 1 or 2 pages to allow you the space for this new breaking story. They're the kind of things that give journalists sleepless nights, really, and it's often a pressure which I think some people don't quite understand. The other area of stress, though, is and I think it's one of the most stressful roles on certainly as a sports journalist, are the people who go out and do football matches. Now, I said before, for me it was a dream. You know, I was a fan with a typewriter or a fan with a laptop. I was being paid to do what I really loved. But even allowing for that, you can go along to cover a match in an evening, expecting to do, say, 300 words. It might be a 0-0 draw. It might be the most boring match you've ever seen, and you file your copy. But equally, you go along to a football match, and nothing happens for 88 minutes. You're expected to write 900 words, and then suddenly, all hell breaks loose in the last 2 minutes, and you've suddenly got to kind of junk everything that all the notes you've already done, and basically come up with a new story in a space of 5 minutes. There was a match, I don't know whether you saw it, about 10 days ago, my football team, unfortunately, and there was a supporter in the ground holding his toddler in his hand. Decided it would be a good idea when there was a bit of a melee involving the players on the pitch to run down from his seat with his toddler under his arm and try to land a punch on the visiting goalkeeper. Now, you know, that's the kind of incident that can happen in a football match or in a sporting event, completely unexpectedly. But you kind of, the guy on the spot, as I say, has got the stress of suddenly responding to that incident late into the game. Okay, we have 3 editions a night on the Telegraph, and basically the first edition you just get in a very, very quick version of the football report. Second edition you update it with quotes and a more polished version of the story. Final edition, it's you know, if there's any further tidying that needs to be done. Now my particular job is I have 3 screens on my desk. On one screen it will be basically where I treat the copy. I do a lot of rewrites and just basically tidying up of stories. On the middle screen, I'll have the various wire services and the things like the BBC home screen, our own sort of rolling blog if we're covering a football match that night. And then on the right-hand screen, I might have as many as 4 different football matches running, as well as Twitter. So you really do need to have an extra head and an extra pair of eyes and ears. It's again, it's quite a stressful few hours, and it's becoming more and more that you've got to keep across all of these platforms to be aware of potentially breaking stories. As Chris Evans said, the words I read out earlier, the interaction is changing as well. That people aren't just picking up the newspaper the next morning or going onto the internet and looking on their laptop. You know, the big move has been towards mobile telephones, but we're also are getting the word out there on various other social platforms. Reporters now, when they're sent out on stories, they're expected routinely now to have the means of recording film or still images. Gone are the days when you just went out with a notebook and a pad. You know, most people have smartphones and have some kind of decent camera and some way of recording footage. It doesn't have to be the most professional kind of footage as well. The key is you've got the picture, you've got the clip. And I think there was an instance a few years ago where Charles and Camilla inadvertently stumbled into someone's wedding reception at a hotel in Scandinavia. And although it was caught at the time by professional film crews, the footage which went viral and which everybody wanted to look at was the one taken by one of the wedding guests from their seat. And there was just something a bit more authentic and a bit more realistic. So sometimes, as a young journalist, as long as you've got the phone in your pocket and you manage to press the record button, that's half the job done really, and you won't get shouted at if it's not an award-winning bit of footage. Now, I'd mentioned the platforms that the Telegraph now uses to get the word out there. On an average day, we'll produce, say, I think it's 225 articles. So these come in the forms of stories, live blogs, galleries. We do 100 posts per day on Facebook, 10 Facebook videos, 14 posts on Snapchat, 6 Instagrams, and 3 posts on LinkedIn. And we also have an iPad edition. I think we've got most bases covered there, but it's always changing. But content alone is not enough. You need to, the big push now is interaction and almost getting the readers involved in a debate. You understand the concept below the line, discussion below the line. So when you have particularly controversial stories or important stories, most news organisations now will invite comments. In days of yore, the only way you could communicate your feelings to a news organisation was send a letter to the editor. Now it's wider, it's more democratic. People are able to have a voice, and it's increasingly popular, and newspapers see the value of it. The loss of readers and advertising caused a big panic in news organisations. It's been a massive blow to not just the paper I work on, but newspapers across the industry. And at first, the response to that loss of revenue, people thought you just have to get the numbers up. And if you get people clicking online, and you could show the advertisers, you'd had so many clicks that day, that would impress them. It led to the phrase clickbait, where stories with a particular sort of treatment and sensationalism would get the biggest response. And I think very quickly people saw that maybe that wasn't quite as impressive as it might be. There's a term that's sometimes used, that these people who come onto your website are promiscuous users or one-click wonders. And sometimes they're not even aware that they're on your website. They've been sort of directed through a link, and they'll spend 5 minutes but never come back again. So what the Telegraph has decided to do, in a very concerted way, we've got, and this was mapped out by a new chief executive we've got. He invited all of the staff along to a local theatre one morning, and he set out his vision. But basically, their push now is they are putting quality instead of quantity is what their mission statement is. Now this is good news for journalists, because one of the worries is that in the past, you've been chasing that kind of sensationalist approach, and there's a commitment from a newspaper like the Telegraph, and others are doing it as well, that they actually want more engagement with the readers, and they say, and it's down there in black and white, that it's quality journalism is going to be at the heart of this, which gladdens my heart, because I have to admit I was getting a bit depressed at the way I thought the industry was going. So it's a more responsible and responsive approach to the way we engage with readers. One of the first things I was asked to do when I was a young general news reporter was I was asked to go round to the family of a murder victim, 19-year-old girl, as well, same age as me. And my news editor at the time said, I want a photograph of the girl and her family. Don't come back until you've got one. Now, I was quite a shy person at the time, and this went against all of my natural instincts. And I went there thinking, how am I going to, I'm going to ask for this. I don't even want to do it. It offends me really to have to do this. The poor family are grieving. And it's a combination, I suppose, of persistence and maybe charming them. I did get the picture in the end. But I must admit, it was my proudest day as a journalist, and it still gives me pause for thought, all these decades on, whether that was the right approach. And the reason why it still comes back to me, have you heard of the Leveson report, which came out in 2012? This was basically to address the excesses that had happened in newspapers. You had incidents of like checkbook journalism, stories were bought, newspaper journalists pretending to be members of hospital staff, to get in and take photographs of people in hospital beds, phone tapping, all of those practices were going on. Yeah, I won't hide that. It was pretty much a low for the newspaper industry. And it reached a point, basically, some high-profile cases where the victims of murders, the families had their phones hacked. And at the time, as a news editor, I used to look at some of the other newspapers and used to think, how on earth did they get that story? You know, I'm an experienced journalist. I kind of know how to chase a story. But somehow they just seem to conjure up these exclusives day after day. And it became apparent that they were, you know, in many cases, they were just paying hard money to get the stories, or they were tapping phones. So I think with Leveson, they insisted on an editor's code of conduct, which journalists are expected to abide by. I mean, very quickly, I'll just go through. I mean, the main areas, they insist on accuracy, respecting privacy, no harassment or intrusion into private shock or grief. The way you handle stories about suicide has to be done sensitively. Children, and especially children involved in sex cases, has to be careful of the way they're reported. Hospitals, no more going in pretending you're a cleaner or whatever to get pictures. Subterfuge, again, you know, passing yourself off to be someone else just to get that picture. Confidential sources and payments to witnesses and to criminals. It's a wide area, and it's been a huge change to the way journalists operate. Now, some of the old school might think it's restrictive. Personally, as a journalist of 40 years experience, I'm quite pleased that some of these changes have come in. I think it levels the playing field. I think it allows proper journalists and responsible journalists to do their job more effectively. And as I say, I don't have those moments sort of 11 o'clock on a night time when I see the back page of the Sun and think, how on earth did they get that story? They don't tend to get so many of those old sensational stories that they used to. We have embedded within the Telegraph a compliance unit. Most newspapers, I think all newspapers are expected to have one now. And basically, this unit keeps a careful watch on the kind of stories you write and whether you're sailing close to the wind. Now, very often in the old days, you'd have the lawyer would come over and say, I'm not happy with the intro on that story, we've got to pull it. We often have stories now that are pulled, not just because there might be a problem legally, but because of this ethical dimension as well. So each month, the journalists get together, we sit in a room with the compliance officer. He will go through some of the stories that have given him or her problems, and we'll talk it through, reminders of the code. And again, I think it's a further example of modern day journalists now are expected at all times to bear this responsibility in mind. Okay, so they're the kind of, there's some of the restrictions, but for a journalist coming into the industry now, what's new, what's the same, what's required of a journalist? As Chris Evans said earlier, be inquisitive, okay? Always be questioning. There's a very famous quote about why is this lying to me? It was made by a journalist on the Times, and it was directed towards politicians. And it's a bit cynical, but basically the point he's making is, don't take the first answer as the only answer. Always digest it and think, well, is that really the explanation? Could there be something else to this? So always be inquisitive. Be gregarious and get on with people. It's one size doesn't fit all for journalists. As I said, when I first went into the job, I was shy, and I went into the job to try to get over that shyness, to be honest with you. There are some people who would have you believe journalists are all hard smoking, hard drinking, hard living, cynical, you know, thick-skinned so-and-sos. It's not always the way. But I think the one thing which helps, from my experience, is be talkative. Get on with people. Don't be quiet. Don't be moody. You know, it's the more gregarious you can be, I think it easier it is to be a journalist. Have an eye for the story. It takes a lot of practice, but I think you can get there. You know, it's not something everyone's born with, but I think it's something that can trained into you. And also tell your story in an engaging way as well. Now, here's a bit of confession for you. There's a lot of journalists on the Telegraph who still don't get the two things together. We've got some reporters who are great story getters. They cannot write for toffee. I hope this doesn't get repeated outside of this room, but there are, and we often joke as well, or I do, that they very often keep me in a job because their copy is so awful that I need to rewrite it and make it work for online or for the paper. But they are just about tolerated because they are such good story getters. But believe me, if they weren't delivering the stories, I don't think they'd still be working for the Telegraph. But when you have a combination of someone who's got a good eye for a story and can tell it in an engaging way, happy days then, you know, and very often the copy doesn't need too much work. But also speed as well. And again, there are so many transgressors on the Telegraph when you've got a deadline, particularly for newspaper, and you want to get the copy away, and they're agonising over their intro, or is this the right way to frame the story? Doesn't matter so much, honestly. It's and when you start out in your first proper paid job, whether it's on a magazine or in radio or television or on a newspaper or wherever, on a website, speed really is of the essence, and there's always the ability to refresh it and improve it, but you will win no prizes for late copy. And I'm amazed the number of experienced journalists who still haven't got that message. Just one of the worst examples I think I can give of that, and it was quite recently as well. And there was a match in Pakistan. I think it was Pakistan or India, and it was between Pakistan and India, cricket match. And the guy who was covering the game for us, what he knew about cricket, you know, would fill volumes. He was a complete expert on cricket. You know, googly, Chinaman, reverse swing deliveries. He could write the whole book on cricket. But his copy was late, so I was chasing him up, and I said to him, Dickie, I said, you know, we were expecting your copy an hour ago. Where is it? And he said, it's been rubbish. He says, we've had no play for the last hour. He says, some silly so-and-so's gone and burned the stand down. And I said, well, yeah, so why didn't you phone me to tell me that the stand had been burned down? He said, I was waiting for the play to start again, so we get to lunch. And I don't know where you start with someone who follows that approach. Now, he still clung, he's retired now, but he clung to the notion that he was a cricket writer before a journalist. I think those days are gone, to be honest with you. I think, first and foremost, you're a journalist. Some people don't even like the term journalist. Some people prefer the term reporter, that your job is there to get the story out. Anyway, accuracy, speed, absolutely essentials. And a good tip as well, you'll see this in all the the articles that you read about starting out in journalism, is study other writers. There's again, I've got so many younger journalists who have come into the Telegraph, and they don't even read their own paper. And we blow our own trumpet. We've got Paul Hayward as our chief sports writer, award-winning writer, absolutely fantastic the way he can go along to an event and turn it into a fantastic article. But I'd recommend, there's a chap called Jonathan Liu who works on The Independent, used to work at the Telegraph, great writer. If you're into sports journalism, Jonathan Liu. Martin Samuel, who works on the Mail, and there's Henry Winter, again used to work at the Telegraph, now at the Times. Read any of their copy, you can't go far wrong in just style and basically how to engage a writer. The new skills, which are being more and more demanded now in places like the Telegraph, it's this phrase, building your personal brand. Again, I don't know if this is something that's you're familiar with, but on social media, it's by expanding your contacts and expanding your followers and engaging people. Almost as a brand, people become aware of you, and the kind of building up of contacts can be absolutely invaluable for generating stories. There's times when and it does happen, it happens in all news organisations. you get a really slow day where you're pulling your hair out wondering how on earth are we going to fill our splash tomorrow morning. And then one of the writers, you phone him up and you explain your predicament, and he'll say, oh, let me phone someone up. And with a bit of coaxing, sometimes it's a bit naughty, some of the tricks that the writers use, but they can basically persuade someone to come out with a line that will give you a story. And that's purely down to contacts. So don't wait for stories to come to you, is what I'm saying. Very often you have to push in the other way. Chris Evans mentioned coding. I know very little about coding, but it's for young would-be journalists like yourself, it's considered to be a very valuable tool. Video and audio as well. If you can arm yourself with those skills, they're going to become more and more in demand. And data and texture, being able to understand how to use data and information, basically technical information to be able to explain stories, because we can do it in online and in the paper as well. We're using that more and more as a tool. It used to be, you look at a newspaper from 20 years ago, headline, picture, copy. Occasionally there'll be a small little explanatory box. Look at most national newspapers now, or go onto their websites, and there will be incredible amounts of work goes into graphics. It's a huge growth area, and if you can at the very least know how to suggest ways that graphics or data can improve the way you're telling the story, again, that's a vital tool. In the newspaper we call it texture. It basically breaks up the great big sea of words, and I think it has two roles. One it adds extra information to a story, but also it's just easier on the eye, and aesthetically it's more pleasing. Journalists used to be first with the news. One of the great things I loved as a young journalist was very often, I'd be told something in confidence, or someone would reveal some information to me, and I couldn't wait to tell the world about it. But it was great, that feeling that I know something that most of the rest of the world don't know. But it's changed now. Very often journalists are reactive, more reactive. That information will have got out on as a tweet or online somewhere. So journalists very often are playing catch up. Now you hear of this phrase about user-generated content, and it's citizen journalism. And there's obviously a place for that. Especially with people with smartphones and with Twitter accounts, Instagram and Snapchat, and Facebook, they can get information out very, very quickly. They don't need any journalistic training. But why I think it's important there are people like yourselves here today studying journalism is it's still a craft to be able to tell that information in a responsible but in an engaging way. There was only yesterday there was an example. Prue Leith, poor old Prue Leith, gives away the absolute, nuggets. It was gold dust, that information, the winner of Bake Off. Now, consider the money that Channel 4 had invested to get that programme, and how they built all of their schedule, their autumn schedule, around the first winner of Bake Off. Prue Leith, with the big hobnail boots, goes in and tells the world. Now, she is, probably at the time, obviously didn't think she was doing anything wrong, but it shows you in the wrong hands sometimes the irresponsible use of social media and images and information can backfire. You've all seen videos where people like tsunamis and natural accidents, and all you hear is like a soundtrack. Oh my God! And that's as much information as you'll get. The job of journalists is to explain it and make sense of it. I'll just wind up very quickly. I'll answer some questions about actually getting into an organisation like the Telegraph. There are several different ways, but we'll go through that if you want to fire some questions at me. As I said at the start, hopefully I try to encourage that. For me, I feel like I'm at the end of an era in newspapers. I've got ink in my blood, and I'm quite sad to see the probable demise of newspapers. They're likely to disappear, probably in my lifetime. But you guys, you're at the dawn of a new era, and it's an exciting time. There are so many possibilities, and 10 years from now, who knows what gadgets and technology we'll be using. And there's a big challenge there for you. The greatest challenge is no one quite knows how to make this pay, or financially how to work. That's what exercises the greatest minds in media at the moment. And the person who comes up with that answer is going to make themselves and other organisations very rich. For all I know, that person might be in this room now, and I wish you the best of luck. If you do find out, I'll give you my phone number. But yeah, I mean, my last thought is, apart from the phrase "I love you" or "I hate you," I think the most powerful, for me, the most powerful phrase in the English language is when someone says, "You're never going to believe what I've just heard." As soon as you hear those words, if you're a normal human being, or if you're like me, straight away your ears prick up and you think, hello, what have you got to tell me? We're human beings, we're social animals, we're driven by curiosity. That will never go away. More and more information comes out and needs to be delivered. It's just a question of how we make it work. But it's an exciting industry, it's an exciting profession. If you've got a story to tell, go out and tell it. Okay. Thank you.
We've got time for just one or two questions, some very quick questions. We've only got 5 minutes. Anyone want to start off?
If the story was rejected by your editor, and do you think that this story is written by the proper way, and you exerted many efforts to achieve it, what's the response from you two?
Yeah, we have round about 5 o'clock at night. We're just on the sports desk. We will we'll discuss the main stories, and especially the one which will be the splash story, the main story. And it is a debate. And you're expected and invited to put your view forcefully. But at the end of the day, the editor or the head of sports word is final. Yet you do have to have that hierarchy. He's more experienced. He's the guy who gets paid the big money as well. It's him basically whose name is above the door. And you don't always have a monopoly on what's right or wrong. And there's been times when my boss has said, I wish we'd done it a different way this morning. And he'll put his hands up and admit he's wrong. People are fallible, but generally, you're up against a deadline, you're up against the clock. You can't spend all night batting it forward. So, I respect the fact that he's more experienced than me, more qualified than me. So I will push it, but only so far. Okay.
Thank you. So
okay.
Thank you, everybody. Another round.
No, thank you. Thank you for listening.